Tonight, we ask a question almost no one dares to speak. Why does the Vatican tremble more at the names of Isis, Osiris, and Horus than at the very mention of Satan? The devil is easy to condemn, a clear enemy, a figure of chaos painted with horns and fire. But the gods of the Nile are far more dangerous, not because they oppose Christianity, but because they mirror it. Long before Rome, Egypt told stories of a divine child, of resurrection after death, of scales weighing truth against the heart. They carved crosses in the form of ankhs and prayed to a mother holding her sacred son. If these echoes are more than coincidence, then the foundation of uniqueness begins to crack. For centuries, the Vatican has chosen silence, guarding its archives and steering attention away from the river that flowed before the Tiber. But what happens when the silence breaks? What happens when we see that the stories we were told as singular may in fact be inherited? This isn't just myth, it is ancestry. And ancestry is far harder to erase than any devil. Like the video. Subscribe, because tonight we follow the Nile into the heart of Rome, and the truth waiting there may change everything you thought you knew. A shadow looms over history that most people never notice. We are told to fear the devil, to imagine his horns, his fire, his endless rebellion against God. Yet, in the heart of the Vatican, behind walls of silence, there is something that sparks even greater unease. It is not Satan, but the gods of ancient Egypt. Names like Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Maat echo through temples buried in sand, carved into stone, painted in colours that still survive thousands of years later. These names are older than Rome, older than Christianity, older than the story of the devil himself. And the strange truth is this: the Vatican seems to fear them more than it fears Satan. Why? Because Satan is safe. He is a villain. He is the enemy that confirms the Church's truth by standing against it. But the Egyptian gods are not enemies. They are mirrors, reflections of the same stories that later appeared in Christian tradition, only written centuries earlier. That is the danger, not contradiction, but similarity. If people ever realized how close the myths of Osiris and Horus are to the story of resurrection and divine sonship, the idea of Christianity as something completely unique might begin to crack. It is one thing to say evil opposes the Church. It is another thing entirely to suggest that its most sacred stories were told long before it was ever founded. Imagine for a moment you are walking through an ancient temple along the Nile. The walls are carved with scenes of a mother holding her divine child. Crowds kneel before a god who dies and returns to life. A cosmic judge weighs the hearts of the dead against the feather of truth. You might think you are still in a Christian cathedral, but you are standing in Egypt 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. These images were not hidden, they were carved in stone for all to see, and when Christianity rose, it inherited a world already filled with them. That is the question no one asks. Why does the Church spend centuries warning us about devils, demons, and witches, yet remain nearly silent about Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Maat? Because silence is more effective than debate. The devil can be defeated in sermons. The gods of Egypt cannot be erased so easily. They stand as proof that ideas do not begin and end with one faith. They flow across civilizations like a river, reshaped but never destroyed. The Vatican knows this. It has collected papyrus scrolls, artifacts, and ancient manuscripts locked away in archives no one can freely enter, and each document whispers the same truth. The roots of Christianity do not grow out of empty soil. They are entangled with the myths of Egypt. That truth is dangerous because it does not attack from the outside like Satan does. It grows from within, pressing against the walls of belief, asking the one question most forbidden of all. What if the stories we think are unique are not unique at all? And if they are not, who has been shaping the story of truth, and why? Satan has always been an easy figure to point at. He is painted with horns, a forked tail, flames licking at his feet. His role is simple. He is the enemy. He is the warning. The shadow that proves the light is real. For centuries, the Church has told people to fear him, resist him, and cling tighter to God whenever his name is spoken. Satan confirms the story. Without him, the battle between good and evil would feel incomplete. That is why the Vatican does not fear Satan. He is safe, he is useful, he is controllable. But the gods of Egypt are something else entirely. They are not enemies. They are not monsters hiding in the shadows. They are stories, symbols, and myths that mirror Christian teachings in ways that are too close for comfort. And unlike Satan, they existed long before the Christian Church was ever born. That is where the danger begins. When you look at Isis, holding her divine child Horus, you see a picture carved into stone, centuries before Mary held the infant Jesus. When you read of Osiris, the god who was killed, cut into pieces, and resurrected by love and devotion, you cannot help but hear echoes of Christ's death and resurrection. When you study Maat, the feather of truth, balancing every human soul in judgment, it feels eerily close to the Christian vision of the final judgment where lives are weighed and measured. These are not enemies to fight. These are rivals of memory. They show that what many consider unique truths of the Church were already part of human imagination, long before the Vatican claimed them as its own. That is why the Egyptian pantheon causes so much discomfort. If people saw Satan, they would see a monster. But if people saw Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Maat, they would see themselves, their faith, their rituals, reflected back from a time far older than Christianity. And that reflection is harder to dismiss. Imagine telling the faithful that the devil exists. They will resist him, pray against him, and use his name to strengthen their devotion. Now imagine telling them that the most sacred stories of salvation, sacrifice, and eternal life existed centuries earlier in another land, under another sky, written in another language. That does not strengthen faith. It shakes it. It makes people ask questions that cannot be easily silenced. This is why the Vatican fears Egyptian gods more than Satan. The devil is useful theatre. Egyptian deities are inconvenient history. They cannot be dismissed as false because they carry too many similarities. They cannot be labelled heresy because they predate the Church itself. The only weapon left is silence. Lock the papyri away. Bury the statues in basements of museums. Reduce Egypt to a land of strange pyramids and mummies, never a place where spiritual truth once thrived. The danger of opposition is simple, but the danger of similarity is devastating. Because if the stories of the past and the stories of the present are the same, then the question no believer is meant to ask comes alive. What truly makes one story divine while the other is forgotten dust beneath desert sands? Long before the Christian Church rose in Rome, another current of belief had already begun flowing quietly through the Mediterranean. It came not from Jerusalem or Athens, but from the Nile, carried by merchants, travellers, and soldiers who moved between empires. Egypt was not just a land of pyramids and pharaohs. It was a land of living gods, whose temples shimmered with gold, and whose myths spoke of death, rebirth, and eternal truth. By the time Rome began to dominate the world, Egyptian religion was already spreading across its ports and marketplaces, weaving itself into daily life in ways that were hard to ignore. In the 1st century before Christ, the cult of Isis had already reached the heart of the empire. Roman women prayed to her as a protector, sailors asked her for safe voyages, and farmers honoured her as a goddess of fertility and renewal. Her image, with outstretched arms and a throne upon her head, appeared on altars far from the Nile. The Romans, known for absorbing gods of conquered lands, did not resist. They welcomed Isis, as they had welcomed Greek deities before her. But this time, something was different. The Egyptian gods did not simply blend in, they carried symbols and stories that would later echo in Christianity itself. Osiris, the god who died and returned, inspired mystery cults across Greece and Italy. His myth taught followers that death was not the end, that through ritual and devotion, eternal life could be gained. Horus, the child of divine parentage, became a figure of power in military iconography, often shown with the falcon eye of divine protection. Even Maat, whose feather weighed human hearts, shaped Roman ideas of cosmic justice and the balance of law. These were not distant stories. They were absorbed into Roman religion centuries before the first Christian churches were built. Alexandria, the great Egyptian port city, founded by Alexander the Great, became the bridge between worlds. It was a place where Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and Egyptian ritual collided. In its streets and temples, people whispered about secret knowledge, initiations, and mysteries older than Rome itself. It was here that Egyptian religion gained its foothold in the wider Mediterranean, carried out through the worship of Serapis, a god invented to unify Greek and Egyptian belief. Serapis was designed as a hybrid figure, but carried unmistakable Egyptian roots. His cult spread rapidly, showing that religious systems could be engineered and merged, preparing the stage for Christianity to later claim universality. By the time Jesus walked the earth in the 1st century, Rome was already home to Egyptian shrines. Senators banned them at times, fearing foreign influence, but the people brought them back, unwilling to let go. Egyptian gods had become too deeply rooted in the spiritual imagination of the empire. This is the part of history that textbooks often pass over. Christianity did not rise in a vacuum. It grew in a world already shaped by Egyptian myths that had been flowing westward for centuries. The Nile had quietly met the Tiber, and in that meeting Rome inherited more than it ever admitted. When Christianity eventually emerged, it was stepping onto a stage already lit by the gods of Egypt, their stories lingering in the air like incense, impossible to erase. There was once a city where the world's ideas collided like waves against stone. Its name was Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great in the 4th century before Christ, it became more than just a port. It was the crossroad of civilizations, where the wisdom of Egypt, the philosophy of Greece, and the scriptures of the Jews mingled in the same crowded streets. Nowhere else in the ancient world did so many competing truths exist side by side, and nowhere else did the seeds of conflict over who owned truth begin to take root so deeply. At the heart of this city stood the Great Library, a place said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Every ship that entered the harbour was searched, and its writings were copied to add to this vast treasury. Within its halls were texts from Babylon, India, Greece, and Egypt itself. Alongside it was the museum, not a gallery of art, but a centre of study where scholars lived, debated, and recorded what they discovered. Alexandria was more than a city. It was a living experiment in knowledge, one that threatened every attempt to claim there was only one path to truth. For the Jews of Alexandria, this city was where their scriptures were translated into Greek, creating the Septuagint. For the Greeks, it was where philosophy fused with mysticism, giving rise to new schools of thought. For the Egyptians, it was the place where their gods spoke a new language yet kept their ancient power. Isis was worshipped in Greek temples. Serapis, the fusion god, was adored by Romans. The wisdom of Thoth, carried in the Hermetica, was copied and whispered among initiates. This overlapping of traditions made Alexandria both brilliant and dangerous. In a city where the resurrection of Osiris could be compared with the promises of Jewish messianic hope, and where Greek philosophy debated the nature of the soul with Egyptian priests, the very idea of a single doctrine holding absolute power began to feel fragile. It was not chaos, it was conversation, a loud, clashing, dazzling conversation of civilizations, and it terrified those who longed for control. When Christianity emerged in the 1st century, Alexandria was already brimming with alternative gospels and mystical groups. The Gnostics flourished there, blending Egyptian symbolism with Jewish tradition and Greek metaphysics. They produced texts that spoke of hidden knowledge, of light trapped in flesh, of salvation through awakening rather than obedience. To the early church fathers, Alexandria was both treasure and threat. They studied its scrolls, debated its philosophers, yet feared the mixture of ideas that could unravel their claim to unique authority. The fires that eventually consumed the library, whether through accident, neglect, or deliberate destruction, symbolized more than the loss of books. They symbolized the silencing of a city that dared to preserve too many truths at once. Alexandria's memory lingers because it shows us what happens when knowledge is allowed to flow freely, without one institution dictating what must be believed. It was a cradle of competing truths, and perhaps that is why so much of its voice was drowned in flames and silence. Long before the figure of Mary was lifted high above cathedrals, there was Isis. To the people of Egypt, she was not only a goddess, but the mother of the living, the protector of kings, and the miracle worker who defied death itself. Her story was not whispered in hidden temples, but carved into walls, painted across tombs, and sung in hymns that travelled far beyond the Nile. She was called the Great Mother, the Queen of Heaven, the Lady of 10,000 Names. To sailors, she was the star that guided them safely to shore. To farmers, she was the force that brought fertility to the land. And to grieving families, she was the comforter who promised that life could rise again even after the darkness of death. When Rome absorbed Egypt into its empire, the worship of Isis did not vanish. It flourished. Her temples rose in Greece, Italy, Spain, and as far north as Britain. Women prayed to her for healing and safe childbirth. Men sought her blessing before journeys across dangerous seas. She was everywhere, a universal mother who belonged to all who called on her name. It was during these centuries that her image began to take on forms that would later feel uncannily familiar. One of the most striking depictions shows Isis seated, holding her infant son Horus on her lap. Her face is serene, her body protective, the child reaching upward with divine innocence. Anyone seeing this centuries later would think they were looking at Mary with the infant Jesus. The resemblance is not an accident. The motif of mother and divine child existed in Egypt more than 1,000 years before Christianity, and it spread across the Mediterranean long before the first gospel was written. That is the unsettling parallel. Mary did not appear in a vacuum. She stepped into a world already accustomed to worshipping a divine mother figure. When Christianity rose, people could easily transfer their devotion from Isis to Mary, without even realizing how much of the imagery was the same. The titles also followed. Isis was called Queen of Heaven long before Mary was given that name. She was called the Star of the Sea, the same title later used for the Virgin in medieval prayers. She was the miracle worker who healed the sick and raised the dead, roles Mary quietly inherited in Catholic tradition. To deny these connections is difficult because the continuity is so clear, yet acknowledging them undermines the claim that Mary's cult was entirely unique. This is why the Vatican has always walked carefully around Egypt. To admit too much is to show that Christian devotion to Mary echoes an older story that belonged to another land and another faith. Isis was not evil, nor was she opposed to God. She was simply there first, embodying roles that later defined Mary's place in Christianity, and that is why she remains a silent threat, because if the Mother of God was once the Mother of Gods, then the line between Christianity and Egypt becomes thinner than the Church dares to admit. In the quiet shadows of Egyptian temples, a familiar image emerges long before the rise of Christianity. A mother sits calmly, her child resting on her lap, their figures carved into stone or painted with delicate strokes of colour. The mother is Isis, and the child is Horus. For the Egyptians, this was not just an image of tenderness. It was a symbol of divine power and protection. of life renewed after tragedy, of hope carried forward through the bond between mother and son. Horus was the son of Osiris, the god who had been killed and resurrected through the devotion of Isis. His birth was seen as miraculous, his survival a victory over chaos itself. People prayed to Horus as the divine child who would one day avenge his father and bring balance to the world. They prayed to Isis as the great mother who nurtured him, the one whose milk gave strength not only to her son but to the entire land of Egypt. For centuries, this image of mother and child spread across the Mediterranean, carried in statues, amulets, and paintings. Sailors kept it for safety, mothers kept it for protection, and priests displayed it in temple rituals. By the time Christianity arrived in the 1st century, the motif was already deeply rooted in cultural memory. This is where the problem begins. When early Christians began portraying Mary with the infant Jesus, they were stepping into an iconography that people already knew. The Madonna and child was not new. It had existed for over 1,000 years, only with different names and different stories. To the untrained eye, the images looked nearly identical. Isis seated with Horus could easily be mistaken for Mary with Jesus. Both mothers are shown offering comfort. Both children are divine heirs, destined to bring salvation or justice. Both are depicted as miraculous figures that embody hope. The similarity is so strong that scholars admit people in the ancient world could shift their devotion seamlessly from Isis and Horus to Mary and Jesus. The transition required no argument, no sermons, only a change of names. This is what makes the Horus imagery so dangerous to claims of uniqueness. If the sacred image of mother and divine child already existed centuries before Christianity, then the Christian version is not an invention, but a continuation. That does not weaken its beauty, but it does challenge the story of originality. The Vatican has rarely spoken openly about this, preferring silence over explanation. It is easier to fight the devil than to explain why the Madonna and child appears in temples along the Nile long before Bethlehem, and yet the evidence stands carved into stone, untouched by time. The child Horus rests in the arms of Isis, as the child Jesus rests in the arms of Mary. Two stories separated by centuries, yet joined by a single image that refuses to disappear. It is in that reflection that history whispers its most unsettling question. What if the most sacred Christian icon was not unique at all, but part of a lineage older than the Church itself? Long before the story of Christ was told across Europe, the Egyptians were already speaking of a god who had conquered death. His name was Osiris. To the people of the Nile, he was not just a ruler of the underworld, but a symbol of life's eternal cycle, the seed that dies in the ground only to rise again as green shoots in the spring. His myth carried themes of sacrifice, betrayal, death, and resurrection, centuries before Christianity would echo the same ideas. The story begins with betrayal. Osiris was a king loved by his people, but his jealous brother Set sought his throne. Through trickery, Set trapped Osiris in a coffin and cast him into the Nile. What followed was not just murder, but dismemberment. Set tore his brother's body into pieces and scattered them across Egypt. To any ordinary mortal, that would have been the end. But Osiris was not ordinary. His wife, Isis, searched tirelessly, gathering each fragment, reassembling his body, and using her magic to breathe life into him once more. From this act came Horus, the divine child, proof that life could emerge even after devastation. To Egyptians, this was more than a tale of gods. It was a promise that death was not final, that the spirit could live on, and that resurrection was possible through devotion and ritual. The cult of Osiris spread far beyond Egypt. Temples were built where initiates reenacted his death and rebirth, believing that by sharing in his fate, they too could achieve eternal life. They drank sacred liquids, symbolizing his blood. They ate bread, representing his body. They mourned him in ritual, only to celebrate his rising again. These ceremonies were not hidden, they were public, woven into festivals and mysteries that drew crowds across the Mediterranean. When Christianity later introduced the idea of salvation through the death and resurrection of Christ, the parallels to Osiris were undeniable. A god who dies violently, whose body is broken, who returns from the realm of the dead, and whose followers partake in symbolic meals to share in eternal life. The resemblance was so close that early church leaders worked hard to silence comparisons, insisting that the Christian story was unique, yet the echoes remain. Even the image of Osiris lying in his coffin, wrapped like a mummy, ready to rise again, resonates with the image of Christ, entombed and resurrected on the third day. Osiris promised that the righteous would rise to live forever in fields of paradise. Christianity promised eternal life in heaven. Two paths, two names, one theme that humanity has never stopped longing for. Perhaps this is why Osiris continues to unsettle the Vatican. The devil is easy to reject, but Osiris is harder to erase. His story does not oppose Christianity. It shadows it, whispering from the sands of Egypt that resurrection is not a single revelation but an ancient human hope. And if Osiris rose long before Christ, then the line between myth and doctrine grows thin, leaving us to wonder whose story we are truly retelling each time we speak of victory over death. In the halls of Egyptian temples, there was a principle that ruled higher than kings and older than any dynasty. It was called Maat. To the Egyptians, Maat was not just a goddess, but the living idea of truth, balance, and justice that held the universe together. She was the feather on the scale in the afterlife, the one who decided whether a soul was worthy of eternal peace or doomed to be devoured by chaos. Her law was not written in books of doctrine or controlled by priests alone. It was something every person was expected to live by, from the poorest farmer to the pharaoh himself. The heart of a person was weighed against Maat's feather. If it was heavy with lies, cruelty, or corruption, the soul would fail. If it was light with honesty, kindness, and balance, the soul would pass into eternal fields of paradise. It was a vision of morality that required no priestly approval and no institutional gatekeeper. A person stood before truth itself, and truth needed no mediator. Imagine the power of that idea. Eternal salvation was not purchased by tithes, not granted by papal decree, not locked away in vaults of secret archives. It depended only on how you lived your life and how your heart would weigh when set against a single feather. This was a terrifying concept for later religious systems that demanded obedience to institutions. If people could believe their souls were judged directly by the universe itself, then priests and bishops would lose their monopoly on forgiveness. Maat was too simple, too pure, and too direct. And that simplicity made her dangerous. When Christianity rose, it brought with it a complex structure of confession, absolution, and sacraments. A sinner needed the church to be reconciled with God. Forgiveness flowed through priests, rituals, and authority. But in Egypt, long before the Gospels, the people already believed that truth and justice were cosmic forces that no human could own. The Vatican could condemn the devil, but it could not easily condemn Maat. She was not evil, she was truth, she was order, she was balance. To attack her would be to attack the very idea of morality itself, and so silence became the chosen weapon. The stories of Maat faded into academic texts and museum displays, spoken of as myths rather than as living ethical systems. Yet her image survives, always with her feather, always watching, always reminding humanity that judgment is not complicated, it is simple. How heavy is your heart? That question reaches across time and cultures, far beyond the reach of institutions. Perhaps that is why the Vatican fears Maat more than it fears Satan, because while Satan confirms the Church's need for power, Maat bypasses it completely, placing the fate of the soul in the hands of truth alone. Among the many gods of Egypt, one stands apart as the keeper of secrets and the voice of wisdom. His name was Thoth. Often shown with the head of an ibis, or sometimes as a baboon, he was believed to be the inventor of writing, the master of language, the recorder of the gods, and the guardian of hidden knowledge. While Osiris ruled the dead and Isis healed the living, Thoth carried something even more dangerous to later religions. He carried words. The Egyptians believed that Thoth wrote a book that contained the names of all things, the hidden words of creation itself. To know those names was to hold power over the world. With a single word, mountains could move, rivers could rise, and the dead could awaken. This was not superstition to them. It was revelation, a direct line to divine wisdom that did not depend on priests or dogma. To discover Thoth's book was to touch the blueprint of the universe. The story of this book whispered through temples and secret societies for centuries. Some said it was hidden at the bottom of the Nile. Others claimed it was sealed inside a coffin, buried beneath the sands. To read it was to risk madness, because the knowledge was too great for ordinary humans to bear. Yet, even the rumour of its existence was enough to inspire fear. For the Vatican, this idea is far more threatening than the image of the devil. The devil is an enemy who can be cast down, but Thoth represents wisdom outside the biblical lineage, a rival revelation that claims truth existed long before Moses, long before the prophets, long before the Gospels. If people believed the words of creation could be found in Egypt, then the authority of the Bible as the sole record of divine truth would weaken. This is why the writings attributed to Thoth, later known as the Hermetica, were hunted, copied in secret, and at times condemned as dangerous. When rediscovered in the Renaissance, they inspired scholars, philosophers, and alchemists who saw in them a wisdom the Church had tried to bury. Thoth was not only a god of writing, he was the one who measured time, who kept the universe in balance, who spoke the spells that guided souls through the underworld. In many ways, he was the mind of the cosmos itself. To encounter Thoth was to confront the possibility that truth is not bound to one book or one faith, but is woven into the very fabric of existence. That is what makes him so unsettling, because unlike Satan, he does not oppose the Church with darkness. He rivals it with light. And if Thoth's book of hidden names ever truly existed, then perhaps humanity has already forgotten the greatest revelation of all, that knowledge itself is sacred, and that the universe speaks to anyone willing to listen, without permission, without mediation, and without fear. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in the 4th century before Christ, he left behind more than soldiers and cities. He left behind a problem. How do you unite Greeks who worship Zeus with Egyptians, who worship Osiris, Isis, and Horus? How do you make one empire out of people who follow completely different gods? The answer came in the form of an experiment. A new god was created, one designed not by prophets or priests, but by rulers. His name was Serapis. The Ptolemaic kings who ruled Egypt after Alexander knew that religion could be the strongest tool of unity, so they engineered Serapis as a fusion deity. His image combined Greek features with Egyptian symbols. He wore a Greek-style beard and robe, but carried Egyptian signs of power. He was linked to Osiris and Apis, the sacred bull, yet also connected to Zeus and Hades. In short, Serapis was a political invention, a god crafted to satisfy both cultures. Temples to Serapis were built across Egypt and beyond. The great Serapeum of Alexandria became one of the most important religious centers of the ancient world. People prayed to him for healing, for prosperity, for safe journeys, and for victory. Within a few generations, worship of Serapis spread across the Mediterranean. What made this experiment so striking was not only that it worked, but that it revealed how malleable religion could be. Belief systems could be merged, symbols could be rebranded, myths could be rewritten to suit the needs of rulers. For the common people, it may have felt spiritual, but for those in power, it was strategic. Serapis was proof that faith could be engineered. This was not lost on later institutions. If a government in ancient times could design a god to unify an empire, why would other powers not do the same? When Christianity began to grow centuries later, it did so in a world where people were already accustomed to hybrid faiths. The idea that a religion could blend cultures, absorb symbols, and reshape itself for mass appeal was not new. Serapis had paved the way. The Vatican rarely speaks of Serapis, because his existence reminds us that religion is not always a pure revelation from heaven. Sometimes it is a carefully planned project, shaped to guide people in a certain direction. To admit this is to admit that even Christianity may have followed a similar pattern, adopting and merging older traditions under new names. The Serapis experiment shows that the line between politics and faith has always been thin. It shows that gods can be chosen, sculpted, and promoted just like rulers or laws. And it shows that what people accept as eternal truth may begin as a decision made in a palace. The story of Serapis does not weaken faith. It simply reveals the machinery behind it. And that is why it is so unsettling, because if one god could be engineered by kings, how many others might have been shaped the same way, hidden behind the veil of holiness, their true origins quietly forgotten? Walk through the ruins of Egypt, and you will see shapes carved into stone that feel strangely familiar. A looped cross called the Ankh, a circle of light known as the sun disk, the shepherd's crook, and the flail held across the chest of kings. To the Egyptians, these were not decorations, but sacred symbols, each carrying layers of meaning about life, death, and divine authority. Yet centuries later, the Christian world would raise up a different cross, surround saints with halos like glowing suns, and call Christ the Good Shepherd. Suddenly, the symbols collide, and the question of originality becomes harder to answer. The Ankh was perhaps the most powerful of them all. It represented life, eternal and unbreakable, the breath of the gods placed into the nostrils of kings. Priests carried it in rituals, pharaohs were shown holding it, and even ordinary amulets bore its shape. To later eyes, it looks almost exactly like a Christian cross, with a loop on top. The resemblance is not coincidence. The Ankh was already known across the Mediterranean before the rise of Christianity, and when the cross became the central emblem of the church, the echo of Egypt could not be erased. The sun disk appeared on temple walls as a circle resting on the head of gods like Ra or Isis, symbolizing divine light and eternal presence. In Christian art centuries later, the halo appeared, a glowing circle behind the heads of Christ, Mary, and the saints. The image of holiness shining as a perfect circle of light was not new. It was borrowed, reshaped, and placed into a new story. The shepherd's crook and the flail were the twin emblems of pharaonic power. The crook showed the king as protector and guide, the flail as provider and punisher. Together they embodied the ruler as caretaker of his people, the one who both nurtures and disciplines. In Christianity, the image of Christ as the Good Shepherd became central, carrying the crook as a symbol of gentle authority. Once again, what seems like a unique image was already rooted in Egyptian thought. This collision of symbols does not mean that Christianity is false or empty. It means that symbols travel, that ideas outlive empires, and that humanity carries familiar shapes across generations. But for the Vatican, the resemblance is troubling. If the central image of the faith, the cross, has an older twin in the Ankh, then the claim of complete originality begins to crumble. It is easier to speak of Satan as a deceiver than to explain why Egyptian icons look so much like Christian ones. Symbols are powerful because they speak without words. They imprint themselves on the human mind, whispering truths that cannot be easily silenced. And when those symbols collide, they leave behind an uncomfortable truth. That the story of faith may not have begun in Rome or Jerusalem, but along the banks of the Nile, carved into stone long before the Vatican raised its own cross to the sky. Centuries before John the Baptist called people to the Jordan River, Egyptians were already stepping into sacred waters. The Nile was more than a lifeline for crops and cities. It was the living symbol of renewal, a river that rose each year to flood the land, leaving behind rich soil and the promise of new life. To the people of Egypt, the waters were not only physical but spiritual. Rituals of purification, cleansing, and rebirth were carried out in its currents long before the word baptism was spoken in Christian scripture. In the great temples of Egypt, priests prepared themselves for ceremonies by washing in sacred pools connected to the Nile. These rituals were not for hygiene. They were symbolic acts of purification, a way of shedding sin, impurity, or disorder before approaching the gods. Initiates into the mysteries of Osiris or Isis also underwent immersion rites, where water represented death to the old self and life to the new. The act was so central that even the construction of temples included pools where these sacred washings could take place. To the Egyptians, stepping into the water meant stepping into balance with Maat, into harmony with the cosmic order itself. When Christianity later emphasized baptism as the entry point into faith, the echoes of Egypt were hard to ignore. The Church taught that through baptism sins were washed away, a new spiritual life began, and the believer was reborn. Yet this idea was already carved into Egyptian ritual, where water transformed not only individuals but entire communities. During great festivals along the Nile, statues of the gods were bathed in the river to renew their power, and the people followed by immersing themselves, believing they too were being refreshed by divine touch. Even the symbolism of death and resurrection tied to baptism existed earlier in Egypt. To join the cult of Osiris, followers enacted the death of the god through ritual immersion, descending into the waters as if entering the underworld and rising again in the promise of eternal life. This pattern is strikingly similar to Christian baptism, which reenacts the death and resurrection of Christ through burial in water and rising into new life. The Vatican rarely acknowledges these older parallels because they threaten the claim that baptism began uniquely with Christ and the Jordan. If Egyptians were already performing water rituals tied to sin, death, and rebirth, then Christianity did not create baptism but inherited and reshaped it. That fact unsettles the narrative of originality. Imagine a believer being told that the waters of the Jordan were the first sacred waters. Now, imagine them discovering that, for over 1,000 years, Egyptians had already been using the Nile in the same way, for the same reasons, with the same spiritual power. It raises questions the Church prefers remain unasked. Perhaps the river of faith did not begin in the Jordan at all, but much earlier, flowing from the Nile, carrying with it a story of renewal too old and too deep to be ignored. Every year, the Nile rose, and with it came the miracle of life. Crops sprouted from the rich black soil, vines bore fruit, and grain grew tall enough to feed entire kingdoms. For the Egyptians, this was not only nature at work, but the body of Osiris himself, the god who died, was torn apart and rose again through the rhythms of the earth. Osiris was called the green god because his spirit was seen in the vegetation that sprang from the floodwaters. To eat bread and drink wine was not a simple act of survival. It was a sacred communion with the god, whose body and blood fed the land. Temples honored Osiris, with rituals that mirrored the cycles of planting and harvest. Bread baked from the first grains of the season was offered at his altars. Wine poured from grapes grown in the fertile soil was dedicated to him as a reminder of his sacrifice and return. To Egyptians, these were more than offerings. They were sacraments, ways of participating in the eternal rhythm of death and rebirth, of Osiris cut down and made whole again through the life of the earth. This connection between agriculture and divinity spread far beyond Egypt. Greek mystery religions adopted similar practices, offering bread and wine as symbols of divine life. By the time Christianity arose, the pattern was already familiar. When Jesus at the Last Supper held up bread and said it was his body, when he lifted a cup of wine and declared it his blood, he was stepping into a tradition thousands of years old. The Eucharist, central to Christian worship, carried striking echoes of the Osirian rites. The idea that divine life could be eaten, that salvation could be shared through food and drink, had already been practiced for centuries along the Nile. The Vatican insists the Eucharist is unique, a revelation set apart from all other rituals, but in the shadow of Osiris, the claim is harder to sustain. The symbolism of bread as body and wine as blood, tied to a dying and resurrected god, was not new, it was ancient. And this is why Osiris remains a silent challenge. His story reveals that humanity has long sought to taste the divine, to believe that through eating and drinking we could draw close to eternity. In Egypt, the people ate the body of the green god through grain and drank his life through wine. In Christianity, the faithful kneel to receive Christ in the same way. Two stories, separated by centuries, joined by a single act that refuses to vanish. Perhaps this is why the Church does not speak of Osiris when it speaks of the Eucharist, because to do so would force believers to see that their holiest sacrament is part of a much older rhythm, one born from the floods of the Nile, from fields of grain, and from the story of a god whose body never truly stayed buried. In the dim glow of medieval cathedrals, artists painted and carved images meant to inspire devotion. The most common was the Madonna and Child, Mary holding the infant Jesus close to her chest. For centuries, this became the heart of Christian art, the image believers carried in their minds when they prayed. But beneath the surface of these holy depictions lies an older shadow. Long before Mary was ever painted on a wall, Isis had already been shown in the same pose with Horus, her divine child. The resemblance was not vague, it was nearly identical. During the Middle Ages, scholars and clergy were aware of this unsettling similarity. They saw statues unearthed from Roman ruins showing Isis nursing Horus, statues that had once stood in temples across the empire. They saw travellers bringing sketches of Egyptian art where the mother and child appeared again and again. To the faithful, these could be dismissed as mere coincidence. But to those who studied the roots of imagery, the line between Mary and Isis was troublingly thin. The problem grew worse when pilgrims and crusaders brought Egyptian relics and symbols back to Europe. Some of these were placed in churches, rebranded as Christian artifacts. An ancient Isis figure could suddenly become the Madonna to those who did not know its history. The Church quietly accepted these transitions because they served devotion, but at the same time, it avoided drawing attention to the true origins. Medieval debates about icons often circled around the issue of idolatry, whether images distracted from faith or led people astray. Yet hidden beneath these debates was another fear, the fear that the most beloved Christian image was borrowed from another faith entirely. That fear never became open doctrine. Instead, it was managed by silence and careful editing. Over time, art historians began to erase or ignore the genealogies of images. The Madonna and Child were said to be unique creations of Christian devotion. Their similarity to Isis and Horus brushed aside as irrelevant. In reality, the transition was smooth because the cultural memory of Isis had never vanished. For centuries, Romans had prayed to her as mother and protector, and those habits of devotion slipped easily into the cult of Mary. The Vatican never declared Isis an influence, because to do so would weaken the claim that Mary stood alone as Queen of Heaven. But the evidence lingers in the stone and paint of ancient artifacts. Each time we look at a medieval Madonna, we are also looking at an Egyptian echo. This is the trouble with images. They carry memories that words cannot erase. They remind us that faith is not built only on scripture, but also on symbols passed down through generations. And sometimes those symbols tell a story far older than the church that now claims them. In the barren deserts of Egypt, a strange movement began that would shape Christianity forever. Men and women left their cities, their families, and all possessions to live in caves and huts scattered across the sands. They were called the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the earliest monks whose lives of solitude and prayer became the foundation of Christian monasticism. But to understand them fully, you must see that they were not creating something entirely new. They were carrying forward older currents of Nile spirituality, practices rooted in the land of Egypt long before Christianity arrived. The Egyptians had always believed the desert was more than emptiness. It was the borderland between order and chaos, a place where the soul could encounter gods, demons, or the silence of eternity itself. Priests of old had retreated into the desert for initiation, fasting, and visions. Hermits sought communion with Osiris or Ra through solitude, trusting that the absence of comfort would strip away illusions and bring them closer to truth. When Christianity spread into Egypt in the early centuries after Christ, this deep association between desert and spiritual testing was already alive. Figures like Anthony the Great, often called the father of monks, simply stepped into a tradition the land already understood. His withdrawal into the Egyptian desert in the 3rd century was not a new invention, but an inheritance. He lived in silence, fought temptations, and inspired followers who came to imitate his discipline. Soon, clusters of huts and small communities sprang up, becoming the first monasteries. Their daily rhythms, fasting, prayer, and strict simplicity echoed the old ascetic practices of Egyptian priests. Even the garments worn by early monks bore resemblance to the linen robes of temple initiates. The desert gospel they preached was not about elaborate sermons, but about living truth through the body, testing the limits of hunger, thirst, and isolation. To them, the harsh winds and scorching sands were teachers, stripping away pride and forcing the soul to depend on the eternal. From these early monks came sayings and stories treasured in Christian tradition, yet their roots reveal an Egyptian flavour. They spoke of light and darkness, of the heart weighed in silence, of visions where angels and demons clashed across the desert sky. The Vatican embraced monasticism, but rarely did it admit how much of its spirit was born from Egyptian soil. The idea of renouncing wealth, of withdrawing to seek God in solitude, had already been practiced by generations before the Church claimed it. Monastic life became one of the pillars of Christianity, spreading from Egypt to Syria to Greece and finally into Europe. But its first cradle was the desert, the same desert where Egyptians had always gone to seek the eternal. The gospel of the desert was not written with ink, but carved into the lives of those who chose silence over power. It reminds us that Christianity did not invent the hunger for solitude and truth. It inherited it, carrying the ancient spirit of the Nile deep into the heart of the Church. There are books that vanish with time, and there are books that refuse to die. Among the most mysterious of these are the Hermetica, a collection of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek name given to the Egyptian god Thoth. These texts claim to contain hidden wisdom about the cosmos, the soul, and the divine order of all things. They were not scripture in the biblical sense, but revelations written as conversations between a teacher and his disciples, filled with visions of light, creation, and the journey of the human spirit. In them, the universe is described as a living mind, humanity as a spark of divine fire, and salvation as awakening to the knowledge already inside. For centuries, the Hermetica survived in fragments, copied by monks who sometimes kept them in the shadows, suspicious of their origins yet unwilling to destroy their brilliance. When the Renaissance dawned in 15th century Italy, these writings exploded back into view. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino translated them into Latin, believing they were more ancient than Moses, carrying a wisdom older than all religions. To the thinkers of Florence, the Hermetica confirmed that truth was universal, and that the divine spoke not only through the Bible, but through every civilization. Artists, philosophers, and even scientists drew from these books. The idea that man was a microcosm of the universe, that nature was filled with hidden laws waiting to be uncovered, fueled discoveries in astronomy, medicine, and alchemy. To them, Hermes was not a rival to Christ, but another prophet, a witness to eternal truth. But this vision was dangerous. When scholars later realized the Hermetica were not as old as Moses, but written during the early centuries of the Roman Empire, the Church grew cautious. If wisdom so close to Christian teaching could come from Egypt and Greece rather than Jerusalem, then the monopoly on revelation would be shattered. The Vatican never fully condemned the Hermetica, but it never embraced them either. They were too close, too unsettling, too filled with ideas that paralleled the gospel while standing outside of it. Even today, these writings remain hot in theological debate. Some see them as harmless philosophy. Others view them as heretical whispers of a rival truth. What cannot be denied is their resilience. Burned, hidden, dismissed, yet always resurfacing, the Hermetica refuse to be silenced. They remind us that the hunger for divine knowledge has never belonged to one faith or one book alone. That is why they live on, not just in dusty libraries, but in the spirit of every seeker who suspects that wisdom is larger than the walls of any church. The books that would not die still breathe, carrying the voice of Thoth across centuries, whispering that revelation is a river with many sources, not a single well locked away beneath Vatican stone. Beneath the streets of ancient cities, in dimly lit catacombs, where the air was heavy with silence, early Christians gathered to worship. But what they believed was not always the same. In Egypt especially, Christianity was never a single voice. It was a chorus of competing visions, each claiming to hold the key to salvation. Among these were the Gnostics, groups like the Valentinians and the Sethians, whose teachings drew heavily from Egyptian spirituality and whose influence left the church deeply uneasy. Gnosis meant knowledge, not ordinary knowledge, but secret insight into the divine spark hidden within every human. For the Valentinians, this knowledge revealed that the material world was flawed, a prison built by lesser powers, and that salvation came not through obedience to bishops, but through awakening the divine light within. For the Sethians, named after the mysterious third son of Adam, salvation was tied to cosmic battles between hidden powers and the soul's journey back to its true origin. In their writings, Egyptian symbols mingled with biblical names, producing a worldview that blended scripture with mystery religion. They spoke of aeons, vast emanations of divine energy, and of Sophia, the fallen wisdom who longed to return to the source. Their rituals were not centered on public sacraments, but on inner vision and secret initiation. To Orthodox leaders in Rome, these groups were dangerous because they offered salvation without the need for the institutional church. A Valentinian could claim to know Christ, not through sermons or sacraments, but through a mystical revelation received in the silence of meditation. A Sethian could believe the true God was hidden behind the God preached from the pulpit, making the authority of priests irrelevant. Egypt became the stronghold of these movements. The deserts of Nag Hammadi and the libraries of Alexandria preserved their writings, many of which were buried for centuries, only to resurface in the 20th century. When discovered, they revealed a Christianity far more diverse than the tidy narrative presented in catechisms and creeds. This diversity was not a minor problem for the early church. It was a crisis. If multiple paths to salvation existed, then the claim of one true church collapsed, and so the strategy was set. Gnostic texts were condemned, their followers branded as heretics, their writings burned or hidden. Councils were convened to enforce uniformity, and the richness of early Christian diversity was reduced to silence. Yet the anxiety never disappeared. The Vatican still treats Gnosticism as a threat, not because it thrives in numbers, but because its very existence reminds the world that Christianity could have been something very different. In the catacombs of Egypt, faith was not uniform. It was contested, debated, and reshaped by people who believed salvation was more than obedience. It was knowledge, awakening, and direct experience of the divine. That memory lingers like a whisper beneath stone, an uncomfortable reminder that from its birth, Christianity carried within it many possible futures, and the one we know was only one path chosen among many. There was a time when Egypt overflowed with words. Temple walls told stories of gods and kings. Papyrus scrolls carried hymns, rituals, and records of a civilization older than Rome itself. Libraries held shelves of writings about medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and the secrets of the soul. But then came the long silence. One by one, those voices disappeared, not by chance, but through fire, confiscation, and deliberate forgetting. The most famous loss was the Library of Alexandria, said to have contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Some were destroyed when Julius Caesar set fire to ships in the harbour in the 1st century before Christ. Others may have been lost in later attacks or simply decayed in neglect. But Alexandria was not the only place where Egyptian knowledge vanished. Across the land, temples were closed by decree when Christianity became the religion of the empire. Priests who once copied sacred texts were silenced, their scrolls seized or hidden. The chants that had filled stone halls for centuries fell quiet. The politics of preservation began. Certain writings were rebranded, absorbed into Christian teaching, but stripped of their Egyptian identity. The wisdom of Thoth became philosophy under the name Hermes Trismegistus. The rites of Isis were reinterpreted as echoes of Marian devotion. Even Osiris, the dying and rising god, was recast in the shadows of Christ. By changing names and shifting contexts, the Church could preserve fragments while burying their true origins. This was not only about religion, it was about power. To control knowledge was to control history, and to control history was to control belief. If people remembered that baptism, resurrection, and communion had roots in the Nile, then the claim of Christianity as a unique revelation would weaken. Better to let the scrolls go silent, to lock away what could not be destroyed, and to reshape what could not be ignored. Archaeologists digging in Egypt still find traces of what was lost. Fragments of papyri in desert sands, hidden jars of scrolls like those discovered at Nag Hammadi, inscriptions buried beneath rubble. Each discovery reminds us that the silence was not natural, it was imposed. Behind every vanished text is a story of choice, someone deciding what could live and what must die. The Vatican often stands quietly in this story, neither confessing nor denying how many texts were confiscated, translated, and then hidden in archives where no ordinary person could see them. The day the scrolls went silent was not a single day. It was centuries of erasure, a slow extinguishing of voices that had spoken for millennia. And yet, silence is never perfect. Whispers survive. Symbols endure. A broken page, a carved relief, a half-remembered myth. These fragments stand as witnesses that truth was not lost by accident, but buried by design. And when even one of those fragments is read again, the silence begins to crack, reminding us that the wisdom of Egypt was never fully destroyed. It only waits to be heard once more. The figure of Satan looms large in Christian teaching, yet his role has always been strangely simple. He is the enemy, the tempter, the deceiver, the shadow cast against the light of God. With horns, claws, and fire at his back, he is a caricature of evil, a villain easy to identify and easy to condemn. For the Church, this made him useful. He was an enemy that could unite the faithful in fear and obedience. But compared to the gods of Egypt, Satan was almost too easy. The Egyptian pantheon did not offer a single opponent to God. It offered stories, myths, and symbols that overlapped with Christianity in unsettling ways. Osiris died and rose again. Isis was mother and protector. Horus was the divine child who brought justice. Maat was truth itself, weighing every soul against her feather. These were not villains, but sacred figures whose themes mirrored Christian teachings. They could not be dismissed with horns and fire. They were too close, too familiar, too reflective of the very symbols the Church claimed as its own. This is why Satan became the safer enemy. By painting the world as a battlefield between Christ and the devil, the Church could draw a clear line. Obey the Church and you are safe. Defy it and you risk falling to Satan's snares. The choice was simple, black against white, heaven against hell. But if the conversation turned toward Isis or Osiris, things grew complicated. How do you explain that centuries before Christ, Egyptians believed in resurrection, divine motherhood, judgment after death, and eternal life? How do you argue uniqueness when another civilization had already spoken the same truths in a different tongue? Rather than confront these overlaps, the Church often shifted focus back to Satan, a decoy enemy that kept people from noticing the deeper questions. Fear of demons was easier to manage than curiosity about parallels. Preachers could thunder against the devil in pulpits. Artists could paint him as a monstrous beast. Parents could warn children that his tricks were everywhere. No one needed to ask about the mother and child statues dug up from Roman ruins or the rituals of Osiris that looked suspiciously like the Eucharist. The devil's image distracted from more dangerous comparisons. In this way, Satan became less of a true adversary and more of a tool. He was the decoy, the shadow cast so dark that believers would not notice the softer, subtler light of Egyptian gods flickering behind them. For centuries this worked. People trembled at the thought of hellfire while never realizing that the rituals they practiced were echoes of something far older. And that is the real danger to authority. Not the existence of a demon who can be defeated, but the persistence of myths that overlap too closely with the Church's own. Myths that cannot be exorcised because they are not evil, only familiar. The devil is simple, Egypt is not. And that is why one was made the enemy while the other was buried in silence. Long before church bells rang to mark the hours, Egyptians were already mapping time by the rhythms of the sky. They tracked the sun as it rose and fell, the moon as it waxed and waned, and the stars as they shifted across the horizon. To them, time was not only practical but sacred, a reflection of divine order woven into the universe itself. The most famous example was the rising of the star Sirius, which coincided with the flooding of the Nile each year. That single star became a cosmic clock, announcing renewal and life. From these observations, Egyptians built calendars of astonishing accuracy, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days, each with extra days added to complete the cycle. Their solar calendar was so precise, it later influenced Greek and Roman systems, and through them, the way we still count time today. Yet this mastery of time carried a dangerous implication. If sacred days and seasons could be measured by the heavens, then the authority of priests and later popes to declare holy days would weaken. The sky needed no permission. It kept its own record. This is why astrotheology, the belief that divine truth is written in the stars, became such a threat to church power. If the Egyptians could point to Sirius or the solstices as markers of cosmic order, then human institutions could not claim to own sacred time. But when Christianity spread, it sought to reshape the calendar. The Church declared Easter, Christmas, and countless feast days, anchoring them not only in Scripture, but in the authority of the papacy. Later reforms, such as the shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar in the 16th century, made the Vatican the guardian of time itself. To challenge the Church was not only to risk excommunication, but to risk being out of sync with the very flow of days. Yet beneath this system, the older Egyptian patterns still lingered. Easter is calculated by the spring equinox and the full moon, an echo of lunar and solar cycles that long predated Christianity. Christmas falls near the winter solstice, the moment when the sun is reborn after its longest night, a festival already celebrated in ancient Egypt, with Horus as the newborn light. These overlaps are not coincidences. They show how much of sacred time was borrowed, rebranded, and enforced under new names. The Vatican fears this truth because it suggests that holy days are not unique revelations, but cosmic events dressed in Christian clothing. To admit that would be to admit that time belongs to the stars, not to Rome. The war for the calendar was not fought with swords, but with dates, decrees, and reforms that sought to erase the memory of older systems. But the sky never forgets. Sirius still rises, the solstices still turn, and the moon still guides its cycles. The calendar wars remind us that time itself may be the oldest scripture, and that the Nile's wisdom still ticks quietly beneath the hours we believe are set in stone. Walk through the streets of Rome, and you will find monuments that do not belong to Rome at all. Towering obelisks rise into the sky, carved not by Roman hands but by Egyptians thousands of years earlier. They once stood before temples dedicated to Ra and Osiris, their sharp tips meant to pierce the heavens as eternal beams of sunlight captured in stone. Pharaohs raised them as symbols of divine power and cosmic alignment. Today they stand in Christian squares, crowned not with golden pyramids, but with crosses, silent witnesses to a history Rome does not openly confess. When the Roman Empire conquered Egypt, it carried back more than grain and wealth. It carried its monuments. Massive obelisks were uprooted from sacred sites and dragged across the Mediterranean. They were displayed in Rome as trophies, proof that the eternal city had absorbed the wisdom and power of the Nile. By the time Christianity rose to power, many of these obelisks were already part of the Roman landscape. The Vatican chose not to destroy them, but to repurpose them. In St. Peter's Square stands one of the tallest, a true Egyptian obelisk first raised by a pharaoh over 1,000 years before Christ. It was brought to Rome by Emperor Caligula and later placed at the very heart of Christian authority. To millions of pilgrims who gaze upon it, the obelisk appears as a Christian symbol crowned by a cross. But beneath that cross is the legacy of Ra, of sun worship, of pharaonic power reaching for eternity. This is the paradox. The Church allows Egyptian monuments to remain visible, yet denies their lineage. They are presented as ornaments of Christian Rome, not as survivors of a rival spiritual system. Their very presence is both admission and denial. They cannot be erased because they are too massive, too enduring, so they are rebranded. The obelisk that once marked the path of the sun becomes a marker of papal power. The stone that once honoured Isis now casts its shadow across Christian basilicas. To the casual eye, this seems like victory. Rome conquered Egypt, and Christianity conquered Rome. But to those who look closer, the obelisks whisper a different story. They remind us that Egyptian symbols were never defeated. They were absorbed, standing proudly under foreign skies yet carrying the same cosmic meaning. Each time the sun rises and casts its light along their sharp edges, the old purpose awakens, whether acknowledged or not. The Vatican may crown them with crosses, but it cannot erase their origins. The obelisks stand as eternal contradictions, monuments of Egypt dressed in Christian robes. They are proof carved in granite that the past cannot be buried, only disguised. And perhaps that is why they still provoke unease. For under every Christian sky, an Egyptian shadow remains. In the hands of pharaohs and gods, the Ankh was always present, a looped cross symbolizing life, eternity, and divine breath. It appeared in temple carvings, where deities touched it to the lips of kings to grant them immortality. It was painted on coffins, carried in amulets, and etched into stone for thousands of years. To the Egyptians, it was the most powerful of signs, a reminder that existence did not end in death but continued forever. Yet, as centuries passed and Christianity spread across the Mediterranean, the Ankh began to take on a strange new role. Its familiar loop and crossbar shape quietly transformed into the Christian cross. At first, the resemblance may have been dismissed as coincidence, but the timeline tells another story. By the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, the Ankh was still widely used in Egypt, appearing in art and daily life. At the same time, Christians began adopting the cross as their central emblem, a symbol of salvation through the crucifixion. Gradually, the loop was dropped, leaving behind the plain cross we know today. This shift was not accidental. It was a quiet editing of visual continuity. The Ankh was too visible, too embedded in Egyptian culture to simply erase. By reshaping it into a new form, the Church could preserve its power while disguising its origin. To most believers, the cross was entirely Christian. To those who remembered the older symbol, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. In late antiquity, the Ankh also began to appear in modified forms, sometimes with the loop elongated or stylized, blending with Christian art as if to soften the transition. Archaeologists have uncovered Coptic crosses in Egypt that look almost identical to Ankh's, the line between the two blurred beyond certainty. Yet, official histories rarely admit this. Instead, they present the Christian cross as a unique invention, born directly from the crucifixion story. The continuity of shape is downplayed, treated as coincidence rather than as inheritance. But symbols carry memory, whether institutions acknowledge it or not. The Ankh had represented eternal life long before Christ, and when the cross inherited that role, the meaning travelled with it. Believers may not have known they were gazing at an Egyptian echo, but their devotion was channeled through a form already charged with centuries of spiritual energy. The Vatican has little interest in highlighting this connection, because it complicates the narrative of originality. It is easier to present the cross as divine revelation than as a transformed Egyptian symbol. Yet each time you look at the outline of a cross, the ghost of the Ankh lingers, the loop of life hovering just above the beams. The disguise may be clever, but it cannot erase the truth. The cross is not only the mark of Christianity, it is the afterlife of Egypt's most sacred sign, still carrying the breath of eternity across ages, still whispering that life cannot be confined to one faith or one story alone. In ancient Egypt, the fate of the soul was decided not by words spoken in a church, but by the weight of a heart placed on a cosmic scale. The heart was measured against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and order. If the heart was heavy with lies, cruelty, or selfishness, it tipped the scale, and the soul was devoured by Ammit, a beast of destruction. If the heart was light, balanced with truth and kindness, the soul entered eternal paradise. This was judgment in its purest form, direct and personal, leaving no room for excuses, no priest to intervene, no ritual to erase guilt. The measure was simple. What kind of life had you truly lived? Centuries later, Christianity rose with a different model. Instead of a feather and a scale, salvation was tied to belief, to confession, to affirming the creed, defined by councils and guarded by bishops. To be saved was not only to live rightly, but to profess the right faith. The Church placed itself as mediator, declaring that forgiveness flowed through its sacraments, and that without its blessing, the gates of heaven remained shut. The difference between these two visions could not be more striking. Egypt trusted the cosmos itself to judge. Christianity trusted an institution. One path relied on personal truth, the other on doctrinal loyalty. For the Egyptians, the soul stood alone before eternity. For Christians, the soul stood with or against the Church. This shift was not accidental. It gave immense power to religious authorities. If a person feared damnation, they no longer had to weigh only their own deeds. They had to obey the teachings of priests, attend confession, accept baptism, and align with the creed. Faith became less about living in harmony with truth and more about conformity to structure. For the Vatican, this was essential. An individual judged only by their own heart was too independent, too difficult to control. But a believer taught that salvation depended on sacraments, could be guided, disciplined, and taxed. It created a system where spiritual safety was tied to obedience. The irony is that both systems sought justice. Both asked how humans should be held accountable. Yet one trusted the inner balance of the soul, while the other trusted the outer authority of an institution. To this day, the image of the feather and the scale is quietly unsettling because it suggests a path to eternity that bypasses the Church completely. No priest can tip the balance. No ritual can disguise the weight of the heart. And perhaps this is why the Vatican prefers silence on Egypt's vision of judgment. It is not that it denies it existed, but that it fears the comparison. For if salvation is as simple as truth in the heart, then the walls of cathedrals and the power of creeds lose their grip. The feather reminds us that eternity may not belong to institutions at all, but to the honesty each of us carries inside. In the heart of ancient Egypt, temples were more than houses of gods. They were the beating centers of society, managing wealth, education, and welfare on a scale that rivaled entire governments. When people today imagine a temple, they picture stone pillars, sacred rituals, and incense rising toward the sky. But behind those walls, there was also an economic engine. Temples owned vast stretches of farmland, controlling irrigation networks that determined the survival of entire villages. Grain from these lands was stored in temple granaries and redistributed during famine. Livestock, vineyards, and fisheries were managed with precision, creating a system that tied divine worship to the very bread people ate. To visit a temple was not only to pray, it was to take part in an institution that fed, clothed, and educated the community. Priests oversaw schools where scribes were trained in reading, writing, mathematics, and astronomy. These schools produced the bureaucrats who kept Egypt functioning. Doctors trained in temple libraries learned healing practices recorded on papyrus scrolls. Musicians and artisans honed their crafts in workshops attached to temple grounds. For ordinary people, the temple was the hub of life, where spiritual and practical needs met. The offerings made to the gods did not vanish into the air. They were redistributed to support workers, build monuments, and fund welfare. Widows, orphans, and the poor could find relief through temple charity. In many ways, temples acted as social safety nets, long before the idea existed in other cultures. This structure becomes even more striking when compared to the later rise of the Church. When Christianity spread, it too built an infrastructure of wealth and influence. Monasteries and cathedrals accumulated land, managed education, and distributed aid, but the blueprint was already written in Egyptian stone. The Vatican does not highlight this continuity because it undermines the narrative of originality. If Egyptian temples had already been centers of learning, healing, and welfare, then the Church was not inventing a system of spiritual and social care. It was inheriting and reshaping one. The economic power of temples also carried political weight. Pharaohs relied on them as partners in ruling, but also feared their independence. A wealthy temple could rival royal authority, commanding loyalty through both faith and food. The same tension would later exist between kings and the Church in medieval Europe. History repeated itself, though rarely acknowledged. When temples were closed by decree under Christian emperors, their wealth was confiscated, their land seized, and their knowledge either destroyed or absorbed. The silence that followed was presented as progress, yet the echoes remain. To study Egypt is to realize that religion was never only about gods. It was about structures of power, networks of survival, and the ability to shape society through both spirit and grain. The Vatican prefers to speak of the Church as the first true union of faith and care, but the Nile tells another story. Long before Rome raised a basilica, Egyptian temples had already been the beating heart of a civilization where worship and welfare were one. In Egypt, the idea of sacred authority passed through an unbroken chain of priests and scribes long before the Church spoke of apostolic succession. From generation to generation, temple knowledge was handed down, guarded as both divine duty and practical necessity. Sons of priests were trained from childhood to take up their fathers' roles, learning chants, rituals, and the reading of hieroglyphs. Scribes, who were often temple officials themselves, carried the written memory of civilization. They copied hymns, legal codes, medical texts, and cosmic myths, ensuring continuity that lasted thousands of years. To the Egyptians, this lineage was not simply tradition, it was sacred order. The gods themselves had established the priesthood, and to break the chain was to disturb the balance of Maat, the cosmic harmony. When a priest raised his hand to perform a ritual, he was not acting as an individual, but as the living link in a line that stretched back to the first time when gods and humans still walked together. The Vatican would later claim something strikingly similar: apostolic succession, the belief that every bishop descends in authority from the original apostles of Christ, became central to its claim of legitimacy. Without that chain, the power of sacraments and the authority of doctrine would collapse. But when viewed against Egypt's older traditions, the claim of exclusivity falters. Egypt had already practiced a lineage of sacred authority for over 2,000 years before Peter or Paul walked the earth. Priests of Amun, Ptah, and Osiris maintained continuity so rigorous that temple libraries preserved rituals with exact precision, unchanged across centuries. They believed the slightest error in chanting a hymn or reciting a prayer could disrupt the entire cosmic order. That kind of careful transmission mirrors the way bishops later guarded liturgies and doctrines. Even the scribes resemble later theologians, shaping and protecting the sacred texts that guided faith. They were the ones who decided what was written, preserved, and remembered. Their authority was not questioned because it was seen as divinely sanctioned. When Christianity entered Egypt, it encountered a culture already fluent in the idea that authority flowed through sacred lineage. The early church in Alexandria grew within this soil, and many of its practices reflected that heritage. Yet over time, the Vatican insisted its succession was unique, the one true unbroken chain from heaven to earth. To admit parallels with Egyptian priesthoods would undermine that claim, so silence became the safest response. But the stones of Egypt still whisper. Reliefs carved into temple walls show priests passing on sacred objects to successors, scrolls handed from master to disciple, the continuity of knowledge made visible. These images challenge the narrative that the Church alone held the secret of lineage. Sacred authority was never confined to Rome. It thrived along the Nile long before, and its echoes can still be traced in the very structure of the Church that now insists it invented the chain. When European explorers and scholars began to rediscover Egypt in the early modern era, they faced a dilemma that has rarely been spoken aloud. The land of pyramids and hieroglyphs contained a past so vast, so sophisticated, and so hauntingly similar to Christian traditions that to study it was to risk unsettling the foundations of the Church itself. The Jesuits, often sent as both missionaries and intellectuals, found themselves at the center of this tension. Their task was to gather knowledge, record languages, and study ancient cultures, but they had to do so carefully, walking a tightrope between curiosity and control. Too much honesty about Egypt's wisdom might encourage heterodox thinkers to claim that Christianity was not the sole guardian of truth. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Jesuit scholars translated texts, copied inscriptions, and reported on monuments with remarkable precision. Yet their writings were often framed to protect doctrine. Egyptian gods were described as corruptions of biblical figures, their rituals as distorted echoes of the truth later perfected by Christ. This strategy allowed scholars to admire the brilliance of the Nile, while still claiming that only the Church held the final key. But cracks appeared. Independent thinkers outside the tight grip of Rome began reading Jesuit reports with different eyes. They saw the parallels between Isis and Mary, between Osiris and Christ, between the Ankh and the cross. They noticed that Egyptian timekeeping, astronomy, and moral codes rivaled or even surpassed what Europe claimed as unique. For these readers, Egypt became not a curiosity, but an alternative history of wisdom, one that threatened to open doors the Vatican wanted firmly shut. This was the Jesuit problem of Egypt. They could not ignore the evidence because the monuments were undeniable. Yet, they could not allow Egypt's truths to inspire rival theologies or empower reformers who were already questioning church authority. And so a strange dance began. Knowledge was collected but framed. Texts were copied but hidden. Reports were published but edited. The goal was not to silence Egypt entirely, but to manage it, to place it safely within a Christian narrative while stripping it of its independent power. Even today, this strategy lingers. The Church acknowledges the grandeur of Egypt as a civilization, but rarely speaks of the religious continuities that connect Nile spirituality with Christian practice. The Jesuits helped create this double image, one of admiration and denial. Their work preserved fragments of Egypt while also keeping them at a distance, ensuring that the echoes of Isis, Osiris, and Maat never spoke too loudly in the ears of believers. But history has a way of slipping through control. The very translations and drawings meant to contain Egypt became the seeds of later revolutions in thought. The Enlightenment would take those seeds and ask questions the Jesuits dared not answer. The problem of Egypt was never solved. It was only delayed, waiting for generations willing to see the past without fear of the futures it might create. When French soldiers stumbled upon a black stone in the summer of 1799, they could not have known it would one day crack open the silence of Egypt. The Rosetta Stone, carved with inscriptions in 3 scripts, became the key to unlocking hieroglyphs, the language of temples and tombs that had been mute for more than 1,000 years. For centuries, Egyptian walls had been covered in symbols no one could read. They stood as monuments to a civilization both admired and mysterious, their true voices buried under time. But once Jean-François Champollion finally deciphered the code in 1822, those walls began to speak again. What they said was not always comfortable for the Church. The hieroglyphs revealed hymns to gods who lived, died, and rose again. They told of rituals of purification, moral codes centered on truth, and visions of eternity that sounded uncomfortably familiar. Suddenly, Egypt was no longer silent stone. It was a living theology written in its own words. For the Vatican, this posed a quiet problem. As long as Egypt remained mysterious, its monuments could be admired without being threatening. They were ruins of a lost world, curiosities without power. But now that their voices returned, people began noticing the overlaps with Christianity. The prayers of the dead asking for forgiveness, the weighing of the heart against truth, the mother and child imagery, the symbols of life and resurrection. None of this had been borrowed from Rome. It had been carved into stone centuries before Christ. Scholars of the 19th century celebrated Egypt as a recovered wisdom tradition, and artists and mystics drew inspiration from its teachings. But the Church reacted with caution. Officially, it praised archaeology as a way to study history. Unofficially, it worked to downplay theological parallels, framing Egyptian texts as primitive gropings for truth that only found their completion in Christianity. The return of Egyptian voices was framed as confirmation rather than competition. Yet, the unease lingered. The more people read, the harder it became to ignore the sophistication of Egyptian thought. These were not the superstitions of an ignorant age. They were structured theologies that shaped empires and inspired devotion for thousands of years. Their survival in carvings and scrolls showed a resilience that rivaled scripture itself. The Rosetta Stone had done more than solve a puzzle. It had resurrected a worldview. The silence carefully preserved for centuries was shattered, and the echoes could not be contained. Today we can read the words Egyptians once whispered in tombs and shouted in temples. Their prayers and poems reveal a civilization that never truly lost its voice. For the Vatican, this remains a quiet tension. To acknowledge the depth of Egyptian theology is to admit that Christianity does not stand alone on sacred ground. The return of voices from the Nile reminds us that the truth has always been bigger than one story, and that even stone can speak when the time is right. By the 18th century, Europe had entered a fever for Egypt. Obelisks, papyri, statues, and fragments of temples were hauled across seas and placed in private collections, royal courts, and eventually the grand museums of London, Paris, and Berlin. To the public, these artifacts were presented as treasures of art and archaeology. But beneath the glass cases and marble halls lay another story, one of reframing and sanitizing a wisdom that had once threatened church authority. The Enlightenment loved Egypt, but it loved it on its own terms. Secret societies like the Freemasons drew heavily on Egyptian symbols, weaving the eye, the pyramid, and the Ankh into their rituals. They claimed to be heirs of ancient knowledge, guardians of truths suppressed by both crown and church. Their lodges became places where Egyptian imagery was revived, but often stripped of its original theology. What once spoke of Osiris and Maat was reinterpreted as allegories for reason, balance, and enlightenment. In this way, Egypt was made safe for modern Europe, transformed into a set of symbols without their full spiritual weight. Museums performed a similar act of control. Artifacts removed from tombs and temples were catalogued, labelled, and displayed as remnants of a dead civilization. Visitors could marvel at the beauty of hieroglyphs without confronting the living theology behind them. Statues of Isis and Horus became art objects, admired for form rather than feared for meaning. The shift from sacred to aesthetic was deliberate. By framing Egypt as past, Europe could claim its wisdom without acknowledging its challenge to Christianity. Provenance, the record of where an artifact came from and what it meant, was often lost or hidden. Many objects arrived in museums with little explanation of their original use. A funerary papyrus that once guided a soul through judgment was presented as mere literature. A ritual vessel became simply pottery. The context was stripped away, leaving behind only fragments, sanitized and safe. Yet the allure of Egypt never disappeared. Masons whispered of hidden truths. Scholars speculated about ancient science. Artists borrowed motifs to cloak their work in mystery. The church watched carefully, uneasy at the resurgence of imagery it had long tried to bury. The Enlightenment's Egypt was not the Nile of priests and temples. It was a curated Egypt, filtered through European hands, its voice softened so it would not speak too loudly against established power. But despite the reframing, something of its original spirit slipped through. The symbols still carried memory, the eye still watched, the feather still weighed, the Ankh still whispered of eternal life. Even behind museum glass, Egypt refused to be silent. Its wisdom endured, not destroyed, only dressed in new clothing. And for those who looked closer, the sanitized displays were doorways to truths that could not be erased, only postponed. Along the banks of the Nile, pilgrims once carried offerings to shrines of Isis, the great mother who healed the sick, protected sailors, and comforted the grieving. Her statues showed her seated on a throne, a child on her lap, her gaze steady and serene. Worshippers travelled from distant lands to kneel before her, leaving gifts, lighting lamps, and whispering prayers. When Christianity spread across Egypt, those shrines did not vanish overnight. They were repainted, renamed, and slowly reshaped. Isis became Mary. Horus became Jesus. And the flow of devotion continued, redirected but never fully broken. By the Middle Ages, pilgrims travelled not to temples but to churches, yet the rituals looked strangely familiar. They touched relics, left coins, lit candles, and prayed for healing. In some places, local legends claimed that the Virgin appeared by rivers or springs, echoing Isis, who was often linked to the Nile's life-giving waters. Icons of Mary with the child Christ resembled the old images of Isis nursing Horus. Only the names had changed. The assimilation was soft, almost invisible, but powerful. The Church never openly admitted the lineage, preferring to emphasize Mary's uniqueness. Yet the motifs betrayed the continuity. Relics, too, carried the echo of Egypt. Fragments of cloth, bones, or drops of milk, said to belong to Mary, were venerated much like the sacred objects once carried in processions for Isis. The faithful believed these relics radiated divine power, capable of miracles. To an Egyptian pilgrim of centuries earlier, the practice would have felt familiar. The continuity of devotion shows how spiritual habits outlive theologies. People seek a mother figure, a source of comfort beyond dogma. Whether named Isis or Mary, the image of the divine mother and child answers the same need. The Vatican embraced the popularity of Marian devotion because it unified the faithful and softened the harsher edges of doctrine. But at the same time, it avoided any mention of Nile roots. To acknowledge them would be to admit that Christianity had inherited more than it invented. So the Madonna of the Nile became the Madonna of Christendom, her Egyptian ancestry quietly erased. Yet the symbols still speak. When pilgrims kneel before a Marian shrine in Lourdes, Fatima, or Rome, they echo footsteps once made along the Nile. When they pray for protection, they mirror the voices of ancient sailors who asked Isis to guide them through storms. When they carry images of the mother and child close to their hearts, they continue a devotion far older than the Church admits. The Madonna of the Nile survives in disguise, a silent reminder that faith is never created from nothing. It is inherited, adapted, and reborn. And though the Vatican may fear to name her true ancestry, the river remembers. The water still carries the memory of offerings once laid at the feet of Isis, offerings now repeated before Mary, the mother who replaced the mother but never erased her. When the silver screen discovered Egypt, it found a land of golden sands, mysterious tombs, and shadowed pyramids. From the earliest silent films to the grand spectacles of Hollywood epics, Egypt was framed not as a parent of Western thought, but as an exotic backdrop, a place of curses, mummies, and adventure. The emphasis was always on strangeness, on danger, on spectacle. Audiences were invited to marvel at the scale of the monuments and the beauty of the desert, but rarely to recognize Egypt as a source of the very symbols and stories embedded in Christianity itself. In the 20th century, films like The Ten Commandments presented Egypt as the proud but doomed enemy of God's chosen people. The pharaohs were arrogant tyrants, their gods powerless, their magic sinister. This narrative reinforced the idea that Egypt was a foil to truth, a stage for the triumph of Christianity's ancestors. Later came the wave of mummy films, where ancient Egypt was reduced to horror, a place of curses that threatened modern explorers who dared to disturb tombs. Once again, the message was clear. Egypt was fascinating, but it was dangerous. It was something to fear, not something to respect as a spiritual forebear. Even when Egypt was celebrated for its beauty, as in lavish costume dramas, it was presented as an alien world, a culture sealed off in the past. The continuity between Isis and Mary, Osiris and resurrection, Maat and moral judgment was never acknowledged. To do so would collapse the comfortable distance that cinema built. By keeping Egypt exotic and separate, media preserved the illusion of Christianity as self-contained and unique. Audiences left theatres in awe of golden thrones and desert sunsets, but never questioning whether the crucifixion story echoed older myths. Cinema turned Egypt into entertainment rather than genealogy. The irony is that the camera often lingered lovingly on symbols that carried deep connections. The Ankh appeared in countless films as a mysterious charm, yet few viewers were told it was the ancestor of the cross. Scenes of weighing the heart or guiding the dead through trials appeared as fantasy, stripped of their theological meaning. By transforming these into curiosities, cinema silenced their voice as parents of Western spirituality. The golden sand of Egypt became a backdrop, never a foundation. This portrayal served both Hollywood's hunger for spectacle and the Church's preference for distance. It allowed Egypt to be admired without being admitted, but symbols cannot be fully stripped of their power. Even in exoticized form, they still provoke curiosity. Every mummy movie and desert epic plants questions in the mind. Why did these people build such monuments? What did their gods mean to them? And why do the echoes feel so familiar? Cinema may paint Egypt as other, but in doing so, it keeps the fascination alive. And fascination has a way of leading people back to origins, to the uncomfortable truth that the golden sand is not foreign after all. It is the soil where many of our deepest beliefs were first born. In the halls of catechism classes, the faithful are taught in neat summaries. Who made the world? God. Who saves the soul? Christ. What must you believe? The Creed. These short answers are designed to fit in memory, to create certainty, to leave little room for wandering thought. A catechism is a list, a framework, a way of shaping faith into something that can be memorized and repeated. But when placed beside the vast cosmology of Egypt, these tidy answers begin to feel small. Egyptian belief was not contained in a set of questions. It was a whole worldview that bound the sky, the state, and the soul into one seamless fabric. To them, the stars were not just lights above, but eternal guides. The Nile was not only a river, but the bloodstream of the gods. The pharaoh was not only a king, but the axis between heaven and earth. Every temple, every festival, every offering was a piece of a cosmic pattern that explained the meaning of existence. Salvation in Egypt was not about reciting the right creed, but about living in harmony with Maat, the principle of truth and balance that governed the universe. Your heart was weighed not by a priest in a confessional, but by the cosmos itself. To live unjustly was to disturb the balance of creation. To live truthfully was to align yourself with the eternal order. This vision is far larger than any catechism, because it is not confined to doctrine. It includes the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the stars that marked the seasons, and the duties of rulers and farmers alike. The Church, in contrast, sought to draw sharp boundaries. Faith was defined by official teachings and protected by councils. Heaven and earth were separated, and the bridge between them was managed by sacraments. Catechisms worked because they created clarity, but clarity came at the cost of cosmic imagination. The comparison exposes why the Vatican has long been uneasy with Egypt. To acknowledge Egyptian cosmology would be to acknowledge a system where the entire universe was sacred, not controlled by one institution, but woven into the fabric of reality itself. The Catechism says, you must learn answers. Egypt said, you must learn to live in rhythm with creation. One is managed from a pulpit, the other from the stars. For centuries, the Church has defended its system by dismissing cosmologies as pagan confusion, yet the truth is the opposite. Egypt offered coherence, a vision that joined science, politics, morality, and spirituality into a single whole. It was a worldview too large to be reduced to questions and answers, too vast to fit inside the lines of a catechism. And perhaps that is the real fear. A believer who sees the universe itself as sacred may not need institutional gatekeepers at all. They may find their answers not in memorized creeds, but in the order of the sky, the rhythm of the river, and the truth of their own heart. The word heresy has long been used by the Church as a weapon. To question too boldly, to teach outside the lines, to recognize truths not approved by Rome was to risk the label that could burn you at the stake. But when it comes to Egypt, the story is more complicated. The parallels between Egyptian religion and Christianity are not heresy in themselves. No one is punished for noticing that Isis holds her child the way Mary does, or that Osiris rises from death the way Christ does, or that Maat weighs hearts the way Judgment Day is described. The danger begins when those parallels are recognized as ancestry rather than coincidence. The difference is subtle but explosive. If Egypt simply resembles Christianity, the Church can shrug and claim the devil planted counterfeit truths to confuse the world. But if Christianity is shown to have inherited from Egypt, if its core images and practices are revealed to be rooted in Nile traditions, then the claim of uniqueness collapses. What has been taught as singular revelation begins to look like continuation, and authority built on exclusivity starts to crumble. This is why Egyptian echoes are tolerated, so long as they remain hidden in plain sight. The Ankh can decorate museum shelves as long as no one calls it the ancestor of the cross. The weighing of the heart can be admired as mythology, so long as no one admits it predates confessionals. Once the parallels are spoken of as genealogy, the line of descent becomes impossible to ignore. For the Vatican, this is the real threat. Heresy is not just about false belief. It is about undermining the structure that gives the Church power. To say Egypt came before is to say the Church is not the beginning, but a branch, and branches do not hold the same authority as roots. This is why ancient manuscripts were hidden, why scholars who strayed too close were silenced, and why popular culture has painted Egypt as exotic but irrelevant. The parallels must never be allowed to become ancestry in the public mind. Yet history is stubborn. Symbols do not lie. They carry memory across centuries, whispering their origins to anyone willing to listen. A mother holding her child is not just coincidence. A God who dies and rises again is not just accident. A scale weighing truth against the heart is not just story. These are themes of human longing that Egypt gave form to long before Christianity. The heresy that isn't is simply the truth that Christianity has family, that it did not spring out of nothing but was born into a lineage stretching back to the Nile. To admit this does not destroy faith, but it does destroy monopoly, and that is why recognition itself becomes dangerous. It shifts the story from divine exclusivity to shared humanity. And for those who claim to hold the only key, nothing is more threatening than the discovery that the lock was already opened long before. There is a kind of power more subtle than debate and sharper than denial. It is silence. For centuries, the Vatican has relied on silence as its strongest defense against uncomfortable truths. When faced with Egyptian parallels, it rarely argued. It rarely issued direct refutations, and it almost never risked open confrontation. Instead, it let the questions hang unanswered, allowing absence itself to protect authority. This strategy is clever because silence does not invite counter-argument. To refute a claim is to acknowledge it exists. To argue against Egypt as a spiritual ancestor would be to admit the resemblance in the first place. But to say nothing leaves the matter in a fog where doubt cannot take firm shape. A believer raised without mention of Isis, Osiris, or Maat is unlikely to stumble upon the parallels on their own, and if they do, the lack of official response makes it seem unworthy of attention. Silence turns dangerous ideas into faint whispers. History shows this pattern again and again. When Renaissance scholars revived Hermetic texts attributed to Thoth, the Church did not publish furious condemnations. It simply controlled access and let the works fall out of circulation. When archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered Egyptian tombs filled with symbols that mirrored Christian iconography, the Vatican did not rush to the newspapers. It stayed quiet, allowing museums to reframe the finds as art objects rather than theology. Even the Rosetta breakthrough, which gave back Egypt its voice, was met not with panic, but with a calm detachment. The Church could afford to wait. In a world flooded with noise, silence itself becomes control. The absence of discussion shapes memory as effectively as censorship. If a subject is never raised in schools, never mentioned in sermons, never included in textbooks, it becomes invisible. Generations grow up believing not because they were convinced in debate, but because they never knew an alternative story existed. This is the genius of silence. It requires no effort once established. It lets time do the work, slowly covering questions in dust. But silence is also a gamble. When cracks appear and the unspoken is discovered, the betrayal feels deeper. People ask not only why they were not told, but why the silence was so carefully maintained. The strategy that once shielded authority becomes the very evidence of concealment. And yet the Vatican continues to rely on it, because silence has outlasted every storm. Where words invite resistance, silence smothers curiosity before it can ignite. In the case of Egypt, this means the parallels remain largely unspoken in official discourse. No papal decree, no council ruling, no encyclical has ever seriously addressed them. And so the absence itself becomes the strategy, a way of guarding authority without lifting a finger. The silence whispers louder than denial, reminding us that sometimes what is not said is the truest measure of fear. Every so often, the Nile has overflowed its banks, not only in Egypt, but in the heart of Europe, spilling ideas that the Vatican could not completely contain. These were moments when Egyptian thought surged into the bloodstream of European culture, forcing the Church to make tactical accommodations rather than outright rejection. One of the earliest floods came through Alexandria itself. Long after Rome conquered Egypt, its scholars drank from the city's well of blended knowledge. Jewish thinkers like Philo mixed Hebrew scripture with Egyptian and Greek philosophy, and Christian theologians in the same city could not avoid that inheritance. Origen and Clement of Alexandria drew on Egyptian notions of allegory and hidden wisdom. They did not name them as such, but the Nile had already touched the Tiber. Another overflow arrived in the Renaissance. When the Hermetica, those mysterious writings linked to Thoth, were rediscovered and translated in 15th century Florence, they were hailed as ancient wisdom even older than Moses. Scholars believed they had uncovered the original theology of the world. Artists and philosophers celebrated the texts as bridges between heaven and earth. For a brief moment, Egyptian voices were louder than the Church was comfortable with. The Vatican responded by slowly absorbing the wave. It did not condemn Hermeticism outright at first. Instead, it allowed some of its ideas to flow into Christian mysticism, while quietly working to redate the texts as younger than the Bible. In this way, it lessened the threat without open battle. The Enlightenment was yet another rising of the Nile. Freemasons filled their lodges with Egyptian symbols, pyramids appeared on European architecture, and scholars speculated that civilization itself had begun on the banks of the river. Once again, the Vatican faced the challenge of ideas that suggested Christianity was part of a larger lineage. And once again, it managed the flood by allowing pieces to seep into art and ritual while denying the genealogy. Even the very obelisks that stand today in the center of Rome are signs of this overflow. Carved under Egyptian skies, hauled to Europe as trophies, and raised in Christian squares, they remind everyone that Egyptian symbols did not vanish, but were redirected. Rome could not erase the Nile, so it planted its stones in its own streets. Each time the flood came, the strategy was the same. Do not resist so hard that people notice the fear. Absorb, rename, and redirect. Let Isis become Mary. Let the Ankh become the cross. Let Hermetic wisdom become Christian mysticism. In this way, the Church survived the surges, pretending the water was always its own. But the Nile has a memory. Its floods mark the truth that Egyptian thought has repeatedly entered Europe, reshaping it from within. No matter how carefully Rome tried to disguise it, the Tiber has never flowed alone. For centuries, sermons thundered against Satan, painting him with horns and fire, the perfect enemy, easy to hate, easy to condemn, easy to separate from everything holy. But Egypt is different. Egypt does not stand on the far side of opposition. It stands uncomfortably close, its symbols brushing against those of Christianity, its stories echoing in ways too familiar to ignore. And that is why Egypt frightens the Vatican far more than Satan ever could. Opposition is simple. You can point to a devil and declare war, rallying the faithful against a clear foe. But inheritance is harder to explain. How do you condemn a system that seems to have birthed many of your own images? The Madonna and Child looks too much like Isis and Horus. The resurrection of Osiris shadows the empty tomb of Christ. The scales of Maat mirror the Last Judgment. These are not enemies but family resemblances, and family resemblance is far more destabilizing than open conflict. If Satan represents chaos, Egypt represents continuity. It suggests that Christianity is not an isolated revelation dropped from heaven, but a chapter in a much older story stretching back to the Nile. And for an institution built on uniqueness, continuity can be lethal. It transforms the extraordinary into the inherited, the singular into the shared. The Vatican has known this quietly for centuries, which is why its strategies toward Egypt are so different from its treatment of Satan. Against the devil, it speaks loudly, endlessly repeating warnings and condemnations. Against Egypt, it is nearly silent, avoiding the subject altogether. Silence protects better than attack, because to attack would be to acknowledge the resemblance. The fear is not that believers will turn to worship Isis or Osiris. The fear is that they will see the line of descent and ask why it was never admitted. To admit ancestry is to admit that authority is not absolute, that it grew out of soil already fertile with gods, rituals, and truths. This is why the Church can tolerate stories of evil, but trembles before the mirror of Egypt. Evil can be defeated, cast down, redeemed in triumph, but a parent cannot be erased so easily. A parent whispers in the features of the child, in the stories retold with new names, in the symbols carved again and again across centuries. Egypt haunts not because it contradicts Christianity, but because it precedes it, shaping its language of salvation before the Vatican even existed. And that proximity, that uncomfortable closeness, is a reminder the Church would rather keep buried in the sand. It is not Satan who threatens the story of uniqueness. It is the Nile, still flowing, still murmuring that the roots of faith reach deeper than Rome has ever admitted. The story of Egypt has always been told as something distant, a land of tombs and ruins, a world locked away in desert stone. But what if it is not distant at all? What if it is the fatherland of symbols, the hidden wellspring from which so many of our most familiar images flow? The cross, the mother and child, the scales of judgment, the promise of resurrection, all of these existed in Egypt long before Rome claimed them as its own. To acknowledge this is not to destroy faith. It is to recognize that truth is older, wider, and deeper than any single institution. The Vatican fears this acknowledgement because it shifts the ground beneath authority. If the symbols are older than the Church, then the Church does not own them, it inherits them, and inheritance cannot command the same unquestioned obedience as originality. But for those seeking meaning, this should not be frightening. It should be liberating. To know that humans across thousands of years have searched for light, comfort, and hope in the same symbols is to see faith as something larger than dogma. It is to see it as the shared language of humanity reaching for the divine. Power structures may tremble, but the core of belief remains. If resurrection was dreamed of by Egyptians, if the weighing of the heart was imagined long before catechisms, does that make those ideas less powerful? Or does it make them more real, echoing across civilizations because they speak to something eternal in us all? The Vatican wants silence because silence maintains control, but silence is not the same as truth. The moment we ask questions, the moment we trace symbols back to their origins, we begin to see the lines of connection that were always there. And when those lines are visible, history no longer belongs to gatekeepers, it belongs to everyone. To unseal the fatherland of symbols is to accept that Christianity is not a solitary beacon, but part of a great constellation. Egypt shines as one of the brightest stars in that constellation, a reminder that human wisdom has always been bigger than the walls built to contain it. The collapse of monopoly is not the collapse of faith, it is the beginning of honesty, and honesty does not diminish the sacred, it deepens it. So if there is one thing to carry forward from this journey, it is that questions are not dangerous. Silence is. Ask why the Madonna looks like Isis. Ask why the cross resembles the Ankh. Ask why Osiris's resurrection feels so familiar. Ask, and you will find that faith survives the questions, but power rarely does. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the true sacred is not about holding power, but about setting truth free. The Nile still flows, carrying echoes of a story that was never truly forgotten. To listen is not to betray your faith. It is to remember that faith was never meant to be locked away.